Hello, this is my video for modeling in the Games Engine. One of the first issues encountered was to find reference images for a biological dinosaur, but due to the fact that dinosaurs don't exist anymore, we have to rely on artist impressions from scientific reports and bone structures in order to make a reference image. These are some of the images that I use for my referencing. From this, I decided the first thing to do would be to make a biological model, just to use as a basis for my mechanical ideas to be put onto. I then decided to look at some other examples where biological forms had been turned into mechanical forms. So if you look at these, there's lots of hydraulics and different ways of making biological things look mechanical. From these ideas, I drew just up some simple concepts of how I wanted the dinosaur to look. So, for instance, the open rib cage, which would reveal an engine, and the head and the hands, and how I'd want them to look, mainly from ideas that I'd seen on the from the mood board, and then some of my own ideas as well. After completing the concepts, I started modeling the base mesh, which was actually due to having the original biological model as a reference. I could then form the mechanical structures around the biological model and making some minor changes to make it look right. It was important to make sure that all the moving parts, just the neck, knees, tail, always had some sort of visual elements so that you could see how they actually worked mechanically. There was no need to take my model into ZBrush due to it already having the form, and I didn't feel that the tools in ZBrush would really apply to this kind of mechanical model, and I think it would make it look kind of, unless I wanted to add some, battered elements to it. But I made sure that once it was turbo smooth, that it didn't deform once it was applied. This image shows the unwrap, or my first unwrap, with some texture applied to it as I started to do this, but then I realized, as I applied it to my model, that there would be very large seams on the head and the tail. As you can see, the head split in half, and I had some major problems with symmetry on the model, as especially with normal maps as well. I then created a normal map for the model by projecting the high poly detail onto the low poly model. This came out with very few errors. There was there was some slight occlusion from the cage, but other than that, very simple errors that could be fixed in Photoshop. I then created a texture for the dinosaur in Photoshop, and this was the result. But I felt like this was just so flat and boring, and after some feedback, everyone said that the texture just wasn't cutting it at all. So straight away I decided to look for some inspiration, and what I looked at was Team Fortress 2, where they have an update where they have changed the biological models into their mechanized versions for the man versus machine update, which perfectly encapsulates what I'm looking for, since I'm turning a biological dinosaur into something very mechanical and very robotic. From looking at these images, I realized I needed to have some contrast in the different metals on my model, and I needed to add just a bit of color. So I added a nice red paint on the top with some peeling effects, just like they have on these models. This ended up being the final texture. As you can see, there's lots of contrast in the metals and the addition of color. One of the most difficult parts of the project was actually skinning the model onto the cat animation rig, due to the fact that because they're all separate elements, you don't want any of the model to stretch, because if they stretch or deform, it doesn't look realistic. It was important to just make sure that anything from one element would be just assigned or skinned to one bone and no others. Otherwise, it would just cause too much deformation. It was like things such as the tail could have some deformation, as it's meant to look as if it can have some movement along with the neck. Using the cat animation rig, I had to make sure to remove a lot of the movement around the joints, as if they move too much it would look very unrealistic. I tried to ensure that the pistons would move up and down as the dinosaur walks as well. A little bit of jaw movement was added as it walked, just to give it a bit of character. And once the model was taken into UDK, it took a long time to tweak the physics asset to ensure that when the dinosaur was killed, that it would fall over correctly. And as a robot, you know, it's very rigid, so once it dies it would kind of fall over, so I wouldn't just slump on the floor like a body. This is an example showing the UDK pawn setup working in engine, and it chases you around. It has an idle and a walk animation, and of course when you shoot it, it falls over realistically and the arms fall off. The material setup's very basic. You have the original specular and the rigid texture multiplied together to allow the specular to give off some colour as well. Overall, the model adheres to an industry standard. It's under 12,000 triangles. However, the animations lacked that kind of robotic movement, which was a bit of a letdown. This could be improved by having much more rigid animation with little variation that you'd have with something that's programmed to move. Another thing to improve would most likely be the texture. You know, even though it does have the color and the metal, there is some variation in the metal. It does look very, very simple, very basic. A lot more time should have gone into the concept and the color theory and things like that to give me an idea of how I wanted to look before I made it. Due to the lack of research in my concept, my model ended up suffering some proportion issues, such as the feet and the arms. Those were changed after the feedback.